Meantime, we do want to turn our attention to a major international headline we've been following for the last several days, and that is the capture of Venezuela leader Nicolás Maduro and his wife. And of course, as we reported before this evening, there was an appearance in court in New York today where they both pleaded not guilty and basically characterized their capture as a kidnapping. We wanted to get a little bit more context on the situation in Venezuela and also just the situation we're seeing playing out in front of our very eyes as we speak in recent days. And of course, we'll know that this will continue to develop in days to come and weeks to come as well. We've got NYU Professor of Latin American Studies Alejandro Velasco joining us right now on Live Impact News. Alejandro, thank you so much for your time here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, one of the things that we wanted to talk about is kind of a deeper dive into the key players, if you will, in this situation. Nicolás Maduro characterized himself in today's court appearance as the president. We know that's kind of a complicated power dynamic already in Venezuela. What can you tell us about his background and maybe what the sentiment might be towards him from folks in Venezuela?
Sure. So Nicolás Maduro has a long trajectory in Venezuelan politics. Although he began his career as a union representative, he was a bus driver that rose to the ranks, a public bus driver that rose to the ranks of the union before then joining Hugo Chávez's political party very early on in the late 1990s. And then through that, beginning to rise through the ranks of what's known as Chavismo, the movement that Hugo Chávez, his mentor and predecessor, started in Venezuela back in 1998. And he occupied many roles, including foreign minister for a long time, until Chávez died in 2013 and really handpicked Maduro as his heir. When Chávez died, there was snap elections that Maduro won by razor-thin margin. And unlike Chávez, he didn't have a lot of the charisma, nor also a lot of the oil wealth that had really made Chávez very popular. And so Maduro instead mostly ruled through the concentration of power, through authoritarianism, and through repression. To your second question, that is in part why he was an extremely unpopular leader. And in fact, elections held last year, he lost resoundingly, but did not recognize that defeat, and then remained in power up until, of course, this weekend when he was taken by U.S. Special Forces.
I feel like, maybe that dynamic is kind of playing into a difference that we're seeing a variety of responses because, previous segments we've done with other folks who have weighed in on this, kind of characterized this as nobody is sad per se that he's gone. I think some of the questions that folks are raising might have some way to do in, how it happened and that sort of thing. But we are seeing, to that point of how he remained in power, playing into the reactions that we're seeing, celebrations that were happening in the streets on the account of some. The other thing I guess I'm kind of curious about is Delcy Rodriguez, who is somebody who seemingly has not only a lot of ties to Maduro, but has also served in roles under Chavez. So what can you tell us about Delcy, and who's just been sworn in now as the interim leader of Venezuela?
Yeah, just today she was exactly sworn in as the, not interim, but as the president of Venezuela. She has an even longer trajectory in leftist politics in Venezuela. Her father was a prominent Marxist guerrilla who was killed by governments before Chavez. She and her brother, Jorge Rodriguez, who actually was the one to swear her in as president, he is the president of the National Assembly in Venezuela, have long held significant positions of power, first under Chavez and then over time under Maduro. She's known as a kind of, radical presence in terms of her speech, in terms of her anti-imperialist credentials. But over the past few years, when Venezuela has entered deep economic crisis, she's really actually been much more of a pragmatist and a moderate, moving Venezuela from a hyperinflationary cycle to a dollarized economy, which helped to stem some of the deepest financial crisis. Also, serving as a foreign minister under Maduro, which then allowed her to have a lot of contact with foreign leaders, and also having contact with other sectors within the Chavista movement that gives her a lot of credibility.
What can you say as far as how she might interact or engage with U.S. leaders? Because, we've heard, I guess you'd say, varying rhetoric from her since the capture happened this weekend. And clearly there's, an intention on the U.S. behalf to remain involved with the situation. How cooperative do you think she might be? How do you think she might interact with U.S. leadership?
Well, I would say that the U.S. intention is not just to remain involved. It's at least if you take Trump to some extent at his word, it's to manage, to lead, to basically dictate terms, and that is important because it's going to highlight both the challenge and the possibilities that Delcy Rodriguez now faces. On the one hand, as I was talking about before, her public presence, her public persona, and as you highlighted as well, has been one of strident anti-imperialism, anti-US, rhetoric. But now she's in the position of having to negotiate and, in fact, in some powerful ways, potentially do the bidding of the Trump administration, especially as it relates to oil. And so that's going to be a very tricky balance for her to strike. And we already saw evidence of that this past weekend, where on Saturday she issued a very strident message against Trump and against the United States. But by Sunday, it was much more conciliatory, right? So this is going to be her big challenge over the next few weeks and months. Is she able to straddle that divide?
How do you feel the people of Venezuela see her or perceive her or feel about her, given her close ties to Maduro?
I have family and friends in Venezuela, and in speaking with them over the past 48 hours, there's a sense on the one hand of shock and mixed emotions, as you suggested. There's no love lost for Maduro himself, but lots of anxiety and concern about the actual strike and what that means for armed intervention, the rupture of sovereignty. On the other hand, there's a sense of, well, what actually changed? All the key players remain the same. Maduro's inner circle are all in positions of power, and in fact, in some ways, have consolidated that power. And so there's now this question of, well, what was that all about? Was it much for show, or is there actually going to be something that changes? In terms of Delcy, I think a lot of the anxiety that I'm reflecting, hearing from folks on the ground, is what Delcy is going to show up. Is it going to be the more pragmatist, the more conciliatory, or is it going to be a Delcy who continues the line of anti-imperialism that might actually create and generate greater conflict down the road?
I'm kind of curious, your take as someone who's clearly invested a lot of your research and your focus, interests in Venezuela specifically, not just Latin American studies in general, but it looks like you do have, extensive background in Venezuela specifically. The developments that happened this past weekend, how chaotic or how tumultuous do you think those events are compared to the grander scheme of the history of Venezuela and what the people of Venezuela have been through over decades and decades and decades?
Thank you for asking that question. And so I was born and raised in Venezuela, and I was woken up by an early morning call around 2:15 saying that there, bombs are going off, and then seeing the videos that all of us have seen, and it immediately brought me back to when I was younger, and there was a coup that was staged in 1992 by Hugo Chavez, and seeing planes, overhead in Caracas, and gunfights, and then huge riots that required us not being able to leave our houses for weeks at a time. And then over the past 26 years under Chavez and now Maduro, similar types of crises, in fact, to some extent, even worse crises, repression, violence, deaths. In that context, what's so surprising about this weekend and what has happened since is how calm everything seems to be, right? There aren't riots, there aren't huge demonstrations in the streets. The kind of projected chaos with the removal of Maduro has not happened. And that has given rise to some theories. My own is that there must have been some collusion between Delcy Rodriguez and others in the upper echelons of the Chavista government to give up Maduro in order to be able to stay in power. Because otherwise it's really hard to understand the calm with which the last 48 hours have transpired after, of course, the very dramatic events of Saturday morning.
Yeah, and I mean, I can only imagine what you will, you know, be looking for, in the next couple days and weeks. But if you could kind of just walk us through, as somebody who obviously has ties to Venezuela, but also has a lot of, background and context of the history of the nation. What sort of, storylines will you be following? What will you look to be seeing, in the coming days and weeks?
Well, two things, one specific to Venezuela and then another to the United States. I think that obviously the arraignment of Nicolás Maduro and his wife, and of course them pleading not guilty and potentially moving on to a trial, is going to raise a lot of questions about not just the legality of what happened, but what the implications are on a global scale of this precedent-setting move on the part of the Trump administration. Are we going to see nations elsewhere sort of China and Russia and others say, well, if they can do it, then I think we've entered into a period of pure power in terms of geopolitics. And so one of the things I'll be looking for is how the Trump administration manages what will take place in the courtroom as Maduro's trial gets underway. But in Venezuela, the major thing that I'll be looking for is, will people, even as they try to regain a sense of normalcy, will they begin to protest? Will they, go with the status quo, wait and see? Will Delcy Rodriguez, again, be unable to straddle this line between compliance for U.S. demands, but also trying to preserve some sense of national sovereignty? Those are the things that I'll be looking for in the next few weeks.
And I mean, I know that this is a really probably a complicated answer with a lot of layers, but to get to this point, to your point about how will the people start to respond and what will this response be as this kind of starts to simmer a little bit or marinate a bit, if you will. I mean, the context of how Venezuela got to the place it is now, I mean, I feel like it's really interesting, all of the factors that likely led up to this point, even, diving into the aspect of how Maduro got in power to begin with, because seemingly that was something where the folks wanted it, wanted this in the beginning, at the very least, right?
Yeah, I mean, as I think you hinted at in an earlier question, I mean, Venezuelans have been through a lot. In Venezuela, of course, but the deepening and, in fact, collapsing economy or economic crisis over the past, certainly under Maduro's presidency, has led to an exodus of over a quarter of the population to many parts of the world, the United States for sure. And what I think that suggests is that for those who remain in Venezuela, to have survived all of these crises and to have gone from hyperinflations of thousands of percent and protests on the streets and repression, for them, they are just seeking some sense of stability and economic improvement. In some ways, they don't really care where that comes from, as long as there's some sense of stability. There are deep concerns about the U.S. involvement and whether it's going to be, more direct than it has already been, longer lasting. But the overwhelming desire is for some sense of stability and economic development. And so that's something that we will have to see whether it takes place. And that will certainly suggest if Delcy Rodriguez has some sort of legitimacy going forward with her own people.
I know we talked on a lot of different, fingers, if you will, of this topic. If there's anything else that you think folks might need to know or just kind of ponder on as we watch the headlines coming out in the next coming days and weeks, what would it be?
I think it's sometimes easy, not easy, but the first response is always to think about the larger geopolitical moves and intrigues that may be behind some of these really world-defining events. But we can't forget that real people's lives are at stake. Upwards of 80 people are now confirmed dead in Venezuela as a result of the strikes in over the weekend. How people in Venezuela especially, but also those outside, fend with the reality of a very uncertain future is something that we should always try to keep center in our discussions of Venezuela beyond whatever we see happening in Washington, D.C. or other world capitals. So to the extent that we can highlight voices of Venezuelans and their sort of ongoing tragedy seems most important for us to keep in mind.
I appreciate that point. A very good point. Professor Alejandro Velasco, thank you so much for your time. We hope you'll join us again here on Live Impact, as we know that this will be a topic that we're looking at and hoping to dive into deeper for a while to come now at this point.
Thank you so much.
All right. Folks, time to take a quick break here. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with more on the other side. We're following some breaking news right now, so we're going to get to that in just a bit. Once again, break time, back in 2.